Hi, welcome to Chai Stories. I'm Namita Sugandhi from Hartwick College.
Hi, I'm Mary Davis. Welcome to our last installment of our series on the history and archaeology of chai, brought to you by Archaeology Now. So far, we have covered the history and archaeology of spice drinks, milk, sugar, and now we are getting to the tea in Indian tea.
This is when it all comes together to become the chai we all know and love.
So when does tea enter the picture in chai?
Well, actually, tea has its own independent history before it joins the chai story. There are different species of tea that originate in a few distinct regions of Asia. We still don't know how these different varieties came to be domesticated and cultivated in different traditions and regions, but we certainly have a lot of evidence for the early use of tea, at least from China.
Chinese mythology about drinking tea goes back to prehistoric times, and the pre-Zhao ruler Shandong, or divine farmer, was the first to start drinking tea, approximately 2700 BCE. The earliest archaeological and written evidence we have for tea drinking come from the Western Han Dynasty, which ruled over China between 202 BCE and 9 AD. Analysis of plant remains from tombs in the Shaanxi province in about the 2nd century AD, combined with historical records about a century later, suggests that elites, and particularly emperors, were the first to drink tea, perhaps medicinally and ritually. Dried tea leaves from the Garlong Cemetery in western Tibet have been dated to the 2nd century AD and may have been mixed with barley flour and made into buttered tea that is famous in the region today. Tibetan legends also suggest that tea came there as part of a dowry of a Chinese princess in the 7th century AD. Early consumption of tea in China was limited to elites and was probably ritual and medicinal.
We know that tea was widely popular by the Tang Dynasty in the 8th century CE, and we have many stories about Buddhist monks and tea, which was often used as an appetite suppressant and for focusing the mind during meditation. In one legend, the monk Bodhidharma, who traveled from India to China in the late 5th century CE, became so angry after falling asleep during his 9-year period of meditation that he cut off his eyelid and threw it to the ground, where it sprang up into tea plants. Well, we know there were extensive connections between India and China from very early periods of time. When does tea get to India? Did Bodhidharma go back?
Well, it's possible that some variety of teas were cultivated and used, perhaps medicinally, in India from early periods. But we don't actually have a lot of concrete evidence until much later
Oh no, don't say it.
In the 17th century, during the era of European imperialism, when it becomes a global commodity.
Oh no.
Interestingly enough, although we have a lot of archaeological and historical evidence for many things going back and forth between India, China, and Southeast Asia over time, but tea does not seem to be one of them.
And although native varieties of tea were growing in the Himalaya regions and were consumed by tribal communities living there, there is no evidence for extensive cultivation until the era of the colonial plantation.
Tea was introduced to European markets by Dutch traders, who were the first to bring it from China. It was made popular in England by Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. At first, tea drinking was a ritual exclusive to elite classes, but over time it became more popular with a growing appetite for stimulants such as chocolate, coffee, tobacco, and the like. Similar to sugar, tea was considered one of the cheaper and more accessible sources of energy. In the way that the consumption of tea was viewed as a ritual for the elite classes, tea became a form of sustenance for the working classes. However, since tea was only still grown in China at this time, it was expensive and difficult to acquire, and was considered a major expense in many households.
In the early 19th century, Assamese communities introduced their local tea-based drinks to Robert and Charles Bruce, who were officers of the British Empire. Although this local Assamese tea was not considered as fine as the tea grown in China, it may have given the British ideas about growing their own.
The British needed to fuel the addictions of the West, but the Chinese had little demand for Western goods. in the same way that the ancient Pliny the Elder had called India the sink of the world's gold. The British Parliament became worried about how much silver was being sent overseas to acquire foreign goods, particularly tea, and wanted to reverse the balance of exchange in the 17th century.
During this time, the British East India Trading Company was gaining more political control in Bengal, particularly after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. After this time, they began to use textiles produced in India and then opium to trade for tea in China. This marks the beginning of the Opium Wars between China and Britain, a very interesting subject, but one for another series and another day. Back to chai.
While the British were fighting about opium with the Chinese, they were also experimenting with growing different varieties of tea in Bengal, Darjeeling, Assam, Sri Lanka, and other areas under their control. By the mid-19th century, a number of plantations had sprung up across South Asia and were often worked by tribal and lower caste communities who were displaced and exploited in ways that still have resonance in these places today.
Much of this tea was shipped back to Europe and America, where the popularity and taste for tea continued to grow. In South Asia, the tea industry was booming. Between 1866 and 1870, tea production more than tripled, and it only continued to grow after that.
Unlike the Chinese, the British custom of putting sugar into tea took advantage of both the colonial market for sugar and the sweet ability to disguise the harsh flavor of lower quality teas. These sugary teas became a source of calories for factory workers and other laborers. Some suggest that the labor that fueled the Industrial Revolution was in fact fueled by sugary, sweet tea.
When does this train of exploitation stop? I want to get off and maybe get myself a cup of chai.
Sorry, there's no going back now. By the 1920s, tea production in South Asia had reached such a high that the British began to expand into new markets, including the South Asian upper, middle, and lower classes. Similar to back home, sugary chai was seen as a way to boost the energy and productivity of plantation workers and other employees of the empire.
The introduction of a new method to produce tea known as the CTC crush, tear, curl method in the 1930s made tea cheaper than ever before. Although the final product was harsher and not as fine as hand-rolled tea, the spices added to Indian chai helped disguise this. Similarly, the addition of milk, most likely introduced by communities in western India that had strong traditions of dairying, added both nutrition and flavor to the Indian-style chai that most of us are familiar with.
Today, there are thousands, if not millions, of different versions of chai. Every region has its own local specialty, and households may even have their own individual recipes.
And that's the story of chai. Thanks for joining us on this culinary adventure, and be sure to check out other videos from Archaeology now. Bye!